I'm Adam Callaway here with Dr. Jonathan Griffiths, and today we're talking about illustrating in our sermons, good use of sermon illustrations. And Jonathan, what would you say are some things we should think about as we're developing illustrations in our sermons?
Well, I think this is one of the hardest things to get right. I also think it's one of the most important things for the preacher to get right. And we all feel challenged. All of us who have attempted preaching, do find this pretty hard. And we look at some people who we think have kind of grown in this and are good at it. And we think, how on earth do you do that? Have you developed some incredible file of illustrations that you can just draw upon week by week and all this? And some people, of course, do have filing systems. I'll say I tried it very briefly for a while, and the filing system was more work than anything else. So I ditched that pretty quickly. But I think one thing I'd want to say is, it's probably worth broadening out our view of what it is we're going to use illustrations for. So I'll say earlier on in my preaching, I tended to think that the purpose of illustrations was to try and help explain theological concepts. So there's a concept in the sermon. I want to find the appropriate use of an illustration is to help teach that concept and make it clearer. And that's, of course, quite a narrow focus for illustrations. And it's the hardest place to find illustrations that are going to be useful. Because often, frankly, when we're talking about theology, talking about theological truth, we're talking often about otherworldly things.
Right.
And when we try and find worldly illustrations for them, they fall short because they don't capture the concept well. And we think, I don't have any illustrations then for my sermon. What am I going to do? And we know kind of instinctively we need illustrations, and the best preachers tend to illustrate well. What do we do? And what I want to say is, let's broaden out the areas where within a sermon where we think we'll use illustrations. And I'll say more on that in a moment, but it's worth saying that I think the purpose that illustrations serve is not simply to explain ideas, but they also do help on a few different levels. They help on a rhetorical level to give people a little bit of a breather. Now, to say that is not to say we're entertainers. Of course we're not. We want to teach truth. We want to proclaim God's word. But we want to help people to be able to listen to that. And sometimes giving them a little bit of a breather is really wonderful for that. Mm-hmm. One of my friends used to say, a preaching mentor used to say to me, you need to let a little bit of light and air into the room. And illustrations just let a little bit of light and air into the room, and they give people a little bit of a break. And sometimes they won't be adding huge substance. I always want them to be of substance, not just entertainment. But sometimes they'll be fairly light and just brief, and that's great. But so they're operating on that kind of rhetorical level. They're also operating on a kind of heart level sometimes, where it will just impress something upon the heart and upon the emotions and help us feel it, not simply understand it. So it's worth thinking about different levels on which illustrations will be operating. Mm-hmm. And with that in mind, I'll say, well, look, sometimes it's great to illustrate even in your introduction as you're opening up kind of the theme of the sermon. Maybe there is something illustrative, a little story or something that will help just to open that up. Or maybe when you're giving the narrative context for some narrative preaching, you can get into the story a bit and give some flourishes for the story and add some color to help people enter into the world of the story. And then, of course, there's a theological concept, and maybe there is some way in which you can help teach the concept. But then you're maybe coming to the time of application. And maybe there is some way of helping people to see how the application could work out for them, either by painting scenarios or telling a story of someone who had struggled with this issue or applied this truth in their life in a particular way. So I'd broaden out. And the other thing I'd say is give yourself some scope to have different types of illustration of different lengths. We can get into a rut where we think illustration time, now it's time for a 5-minute story. Yeah. But actually, maybe all you need is a little line in a piece of narrative where you just add that little bit of color. And it changes the mood, it lightens the atmosphere, it presents things in a different kind of way.
Yeah, I've heard that described as macro and micro illustration.
It's helpful.
Yeah, I think sometimes those macro ones, and I wrestle with this, and maybe you have a thought on this, but sometimes some of these macro ones can be so good and so compelling that people come away, and there's such a large bulk of the sermon that people come away remembering that That's what they're talking about around their tables at lunch or whatever. What a great story. And it doesn't serve as much as a window to see the text, but almost like a wall.
Absolutely. And, some preachers are such wonderful storytellers. They get carried away with their own stories, and the story comes to dominate, and the text becomes the servant of the story. I think we've probably all seen that happen. Maybe we've all, some of us have fallen into that. We have to be really careful about it, I think. That's right.
And you serve as a bit of a preaching mentor for me. And I remember one thing you said to me is to be careful about trivializing truth. Like there are some kinds of illustrations we might use that actually make light of serious things. Maybe you can speak into that as well.
I think that is just sometimes a danger, and that's just getting our tone and our emotional register and everything, accurate in terms of our handling of the text. But I think I've seen that done, and that's partly what I wanted to say with illustrating theological truth. I mean, there's some theological truths you're just not going to illustrate well, and you're better to use illustration at different points in the sermon. I often feel this is the way with the cross. When we're talking about the atonement, most illustrations don't work very well. And that's not to say when you're preaching the cross you have no illustration, but I would say just be very, very careful that you don't illustrate it badly. I would say it'd be better to illustrate at the level of application or introduction or something else, but not at the core of teaching the doctrine of the atonement.
That's great. And maybe one more thing. I've heard sometimes that one of the best ways to illustrate the Bible is with the Bible. Do you have thoughts about that as well?
Well, that can be great. And sometimes, we will, if we're teaching an epistle, we can dive into a piece of narrative or even some of the record in Acts and so on to find some color. Again, though, the danger there is that we're not changing the mood or adjusting the atmosphere sufficiently if we're just functionally cross-referencing. And so that's something to be aware of, but it can be great. I think another thing I just throw in, Adam, I was just reflecting on this. One of the things that I heard an experienced preacher say early on in my time, which was so helpful to me, and I'll just kind of repeat it here. He was saying, we can feel a little bit bound, we can feel a little bit hamstrung to think, where am I going to find this illustration? It seems like experienced preachers just have these things come to them, or they just know so much, or they've got a bank of these things. And this preacher said, you don't wait for these things just to come to you. You go out and kind of get them, and you can get them through your ordinary everyday experience and what you're just engaging with in life. If you're creative, you can use your experiences throughout the week, sometimes very, very effectively, and turn them into great illustrations. And I would say as part of that, it's great to be having some inputs in your life and some experiences in your life that are not purely commentary reading. You can be very one-dimensional, and if all you ever do is read theological books, be reading some other things. I mean, I'm a bit of a news junkie. I like knowing what's going on in politics and in the markets a little bit. I'm interested in economics and stuff like that. And so I'm reading a little bit all the time, and I like reading other things as well. If I have any time for it, I like reading a little bit of history and one or two other topics, or even watching some interesting documentaries, if you and you can find that your intellectual library has got some interesting material in that can be used. And actually, if you're keeping your mind fertile in that way, you'll find that there is illustrative material available. So that would be an encouragement I'd add as well.
That's great. I think I've heard that life itself is an illustration waiting to happen. So
there you go.
Yeah, that's really helpful, Jonathan. So thank you.
Thank you.